Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. One of the most fascinating matchups we are going to see early on in the 2024 college football season. Colorado on the road, Lincoln, Nebraska, week 2. And Dill, I think we've both been fired up for this matchup since the early days of January. Going to get into some keys to the matchup, some really early game predictions as well. Before we do, just want to say many of you guys who've been rocking with the fellas for the last couple of years know, light it up in the comment section. That's the best part about doing these game predictions, hearing from you guys, whether you guys agree with the boys, whether you guys disagree with the boys, whether you're going at it with the opposing fan base. Still, Colorado, Nebraska, really one of the better rivalries that we see across college football. Let it fly in the comment section if y'all do enjoy the content. Consider subscribing to the channel. And Dill, without further ado, you get into this matchup, and I think what entices me so much about both of these programs is I think they're two of the most improved teams in the country heading into 2024. I'll kind of give you the tee box. We can start with either Colorado, Nebraska, whoever you want to cook with. Let's talk about where these teams got better from last year in 2023.
I think you said it, and that's kind of the story of both programs is they both kind of had two. Colorado's offensive line and Nebraska's quarterback play, both those respective units were like kind of light years behind what they needed to be. And I think we're holding these two programs back because you look, I mean, there's no doubt in our mind Colorado has a lot of high-end talent compared to what that record was, right? Nebraska's a team that I think you started to see come together a little bit more and more. But again, when you can't throw the ball and you don't have a quarterback you can trust, it's really, really hard to run good offense. I think both teams did their respective thing, if you will. You see what Colorado does in the transfer portal, adding a guy like Jordan Seaton into that pipeline, really big additions. And then Nebraska, the obvious, bring in 5-star quarterback Dylan Raiola, along with some good wide receivers to help him out. So it's a really interesting game because, frankly, both these teams, I think, are going to look a whole lot different than they were last year.
I look at Colorado and say a whole new starting offensive line. Obviously had line by true freshman 5-star left tackle Jordan Seaton, but Dill, the quality of offensive linemen that they brought in this transfer portal cycle as opposed to 12 months ago, it's night and day. Like this offensive line on paper, I think can be a very solid unit for Colorado. I think the big question is, can they come together as an offensive line unit and play good football with all the new faces? But I think the talent is certainly there. I think they got better in the front seven on the defensive side of the football as well. I think Coach Prime looked at this roster and said, hey, where were the aspects that were holding us back? We know we have one of the best quarterbacks in the country with Shedeur Sanders. We know we have one of the most talented football players in the country in Travis Hunter. There's a lot of really bright spots on this Colorado roster, and I think they addressed these spots that really held that team back in 2023. Then you look at Nebraska, you said it, similar story, right? Not only bringing in Dylan Raiola, but bringing in some difference makers in the transfer portal at the wide receiver spot, because that was not a very good spot for Nebraska last year. So I look at both these programs that, had some decent success for year one coaches with Coach Prime and Matt Rhule respectively. They get so much better heading into year two with both of these coaches. Dill, let's get into some keys to the game. And let's start with this Nebraska offense going up against the Colorado defense. Both units struggled a lot last year. When you're talking about keys to the game for this Nebraska offense, where are you starting?
I think it's still going to be about running the ball. And even last year, you saw when they were having success on the ground, they were able to move it. Obviously, the turnovers were a huge issue in holding them back. But I still think you don't want to get into a shootout with this Colorado offense. And especially, I don't think you necessarily want to need to attack this Colorado secondary because that arguably is their most talented unit top to bottom. I mean, they're loaded across the board. I think they have a handful of NFL guys. And that, to me, is not necessarily where you want to attack Colorado. I think, again, you want to see kind of what improvements they've made in that front seven. And I think you mentioned it. You bring in guys like Nikhai Hill-Green, bring in those two guys from Pitt who are really, really good players. I still think, though, that you kind of compare that to their secondary, that's probably Nebraska's best shot, especially having a very much continuity in their offensive line on the Nebraska side.
I think you make a good point. I look at this game and say the winner of this game depends on how this game is played. Right? If this becomes a shootout with a lot of possessions and a lot of points on the board, Colorado's winning that football game. If this becomes a classic Big Ten game where you are running the football, it's kind of a time of possession, limited the amount of time Shedeur Sanders gets to touch the football, then Nebraska's probably winning that game. And I think one of the bigger questions is, what team can get the game played on their terms. And for Nebraska, it's running the football. I mean, you look at the teams that had success against Colorado last year. You look at Colorado's defense outside the top 100 in rushing defense last year. Teams ran the football, played slow, controlled the time of possession, and just limited the amount of time Shedeur Sanders got to touch the football. And that was a recipe for winning. You look at Nebraska, they ran the football 62% of the time last year. That was top 10 in the country. I don't think it's a secret in terms of how Matt Rhule wants to win this football game. It's on the ground. I think the big question is, did Colorado do enough in the front seven to really hold up against this Nebraska rushing attack, which we think is going to be improved in 2020?
Because it'll be good because you look, Nebraska did add, like, they're deeper in that running back room. I think more talented in that running back room. The offensive line, again, you just think will make natural progression because they were able to retain so much of that unit. And just, again, considering the steps they made in Matt Rhule's first year, I think if they kind of continue on that trajectory, you look really good there. And then I think you're right. Again, I think Colorado, I think that's one thing people like try to compare last year to this year in terms of what they did in the portal. I mean, those guys they brought in this year are a much higher caliber player, especially those defensive ends. I mean, those are the guys I think you're kind of looking at to be those impact guys. Can you make a couple negative plays and knock Nebraska off course? Because that's probably their answer. I think, again, you maybe have more questions about what they have in the interior, but there's no doubt they have some real game wreckers in that edge.
And you look at Nebraska on offense, you got a true freshman quarterback that's expected to start. You do not want to put him in a lot of third and long situations. The best thing you can do for a true freshman quarterback is get the run game going. That's what Matt Rhule is going to try to do. I think that's probably the biggest storyline of this football game. If Nebraska runs for 240-plus yards, controls the time possession, you look up at the scoreboard, Nebraska probably wins. If they don't hit some of those metrics, you're probably looking at Colorado winning this football game. Switching over, Dill, Nebraska defense that was elite last year, right? Top 20 in almost every single metric that you look at. You look at this Colorado offense. I'm so high on it, and I've been very vocal. There's not many quarterbacks across the country I'm taking over Shedeur Sanders. He is one of the most prolific, dynamic quarterbacks that you see, and he's got a ton of weapons on the outside. We talked about the offensive line. That's obviously point one. Can they come together and be a little bit better as a pass protection unit? Tony White's going to throw a lot of different looks at him. I think the communication with this offensive line is probably the bigger storyline than the player's good enough. I think the players are good enough, but can you make sure you're communicating, picking up pressure and blitzes when they're called? And I think secondly, if I'm looking for a key for Colorado on offense, you're probably just trying to get some matchups that favor you. You look at Colorado's going to play 4 wide receiver sets. They probably aren't going to use a tight end a ton in this football game. You look at Nebraska in the defensive back room. We love Tommy Hill. We love Malcolm Hartzog. Ethan Nation not with the team right now. You look at Bly Hill struggling with an injury. They bring in Sayre Wright, who's going to be only with the team for a couple months until they kick off. And then you're probably relying on some young cats in the defensive back room. Can Colorado get some matchups that favor them? Can you get LeJontay Wester on a true freshman Mario Buford, for example, and then go to work attacking those matchups? That is when I look at Colorado's key to the game. Can you play your matchups and attack Nebraska where we have some question marks? And if they can do that, again, you're probably favoring Colorado in this matchup.
Especially because you kind of look, I just don't see Colorado having a ton of success on the ground. I think that's running right into the teeth of where you are as a Nebraska defense. I mean, those two guys in the middle, Nash and Ty, is really, really good defensive tackles. Probably one of the better units you'll see, certainly in the Big Ten, arguably in the country as well. So, again, I don't know that's where Colorado is going to find their success, but I think you're right. If they can kind of wear on that secondary, and you kind of see it, just feels like an exhausting offense to kind of cover.
Yeah.
How much movement there is, how much long developing routes there are, and the fact that Shedeur can kind of target every part of the field. Again, when you kind of think about Nebraska, your one question about their defense, I think, is their back half depth, and that's probably where Colorado is going to want to challenge it, because I think they have 8 guys you're really, really comfortable with putting out on the field.
Yeah, the depth in this wide receiver room and the amount of different playmakers, it's one of the better wide receiver rooms in terms of just loaded amount of names that you see in the country.
And that's where you get into, like, again, why it's so important for Nebraska to run the ball the way we think they can. I mean, if they really get into a shootout, the back half depth is certainly a question. And then again, Colorado, the way they've reloaded that wide receiver room, that's where I think they can wear on teams.
I want to circle back to a point that you made that I think you might have glossed over that I think is a little bit more important, and that's running the football for Colorado. Look, Colorado's not going to run the football as much as Nebraska because it doesn't make sense to. You have one of the better quarterbacks in the country in Shedeur Sanders. You want him throwing the football a lot. That being said, why Colorado, I think, struggled at times last year is they were miserable at running the football. 2.3 yards per carry. That was 133rd in the country. They faced a lot of third and longs because they were unsuccessful on first and second down. You look at this Nebraska defense, especially night game in Lincoln, Nebraska. We've been in that environment. It gets extremely rowdy. You do not want to live in third and long. I'm not saying Colorado needs to run the football for 200 yards in this game. You have to have some semblance of it because you don't want to just be relying on this offensive line to be in these third and long situations where Tony White's going to get creative and bring a lot of pressure. That's kind of how I look at this.
It probably shouldn't have said it like, oh, they don't need to run the ball. It's like, again, when you're playing good teams, and I think Nebraska's kind of pushing themselves into that, where you can't just do one thing against them. You need to be multidimensional and be a complete team. I think both teams, frankly, are getting to that point. I think you're probably right. You want to see it be respectable, at least for sure. But again, I don't feel like that's where Colorado's favored at the end of the day. I just don't expect them to run the ball for like 150 yards.
Agreed. And that was just something I felt like nobody talked enough about was the struggle with the run games. I think they like to point, obviously the offensive line wasn't good enough run blocking or in pass protection. This Colorado offense, as I go back and watch 2023, they were just so often in these second and third and longs because they couldn't run the football, and it just wasn't a good recipe. Again,
and that would be an interesting one because I think you look, Dallin Hayden's a better pure ball carrier, I think, than probably anyone they had from last year. And they had good guys who could do things, but Dallin Hayden, I think, when he's on, can legit run the ball at a very high level, like running back one kind of way.
100%. We've been very vocal that Dallin Hayden's a really good running back coming from Ohio State. Dylan, let's get into the pick here. All right. Colorado on the road, 6.5-point dogs against a team that they beat by double digits last year. I don't put that much stock in what we saw last year because I think both of these teams are so sick. Both teams. I'm not just saying Nebraska. I think both teams get a lot better. You're going to see different ball clubs or that probably different programs than you see in 2020 than we saw in 2023. I'll put you on the spot first. 6.5 points. Who are you taking in this game here?
I mean, this is such a brutally difficult pick to make preseason just because I mean, both teams, I think you have a lot of optimism, but a lot of questions, frankly. I mean, is that Colorado offensive line going to come together? How good is Dylan Rhule essentially going to be at that quarterback spot? So, again, I think you're really just trying to make a few or just a lot of assumptions at the end of the day. I probably lean Nebraska, I should say, just because of the continuity factor. And no, that was just a Freudian slip.
The pump fake.
That's a tough misspeak, but I do just like, again, the fact that Nebraska does return so much more of that team and in the infrastructure, I shouldn't say infrastructure, but just the core of what they have is still intact. I really do think that matters a lot in today's college football era. And obviously, I think Nebraska was starting from a much further point when Matt Rhule took over than where Coach Prime in Colorado took over. But I do think that fact of just a general continuity in both sides of the ball, I think, is very important.
I think you make a good point. And that's something that not enough people talk about with this era of the transfer portal is that like having a team that has a lot of returning production, and Nebraska, I believe, is top 15 in the country in returning production. That matters, especially early on in the season in a massive game in a rowdy environment.
It creates less questions, I think, at the end of the day when you're kind of splitting these two teams down. You have an inherent a lot of questions for both of them just because of how much work they kind of did in the offseason. I just think with Nebraska, you've just seen a lot more from the guys you're going to see.
I'm gonna go Colorado here, especially with 6.5 points. The people who've listened to me talk and kind of pick these games, a lot of times I just look at the quarterbacks and it comes down to what quarterback do I trust more right now. And it's really hard to bet against Shedeur Sanders going up against a true freshman. The Nebraska fans know that I am extremely high on Dylan Rhule. This game certainly can go both ways. But as I sit right now, it's really hard to not take Shedeur Sanders again in a game of this magnitude against a true freshman quarterback. So I'll take Colorado. You'll take Nebraska. Dill, a game that we're going to look at a lot of different ways. We might even both change our picks after.
I was going to say, if like Colorado goes and kind of physically imposes themselves on North Dakota State, let's say, in my opinion, changes a whole lot.
Yeah, that's why we're going to get into that North Dakota State game, which I think a lot of Colorado fans might be slightly. That North Dakota State team, Coach Prime said it at Big 12 Media Day. That is a very well-run program that is always physical along the line of scrimmage. I have my eyes on that game and say, hey, what does Colorado look like along the lines of scrimmage against a North Dakota State team that we've seen physically impose their will against Power 5 programs over the last decade? I'm going Colorado. You're going Nebraska. This one is going to be a dynamite football game. Dill, the boys might even be in attendance in Lincoln, Nebraska. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.